For Jeff, being able to join the Army like he did, he felt that it was continuing kind of a legacy that my grandfather and my father laid out there.
My grandfather was in the U.S. Army. He was a balloon pilot in World War I, and he ended up getting mustard gas poisoning. And then my mom's two brothers were both in the Army. Uncle Verd drove Jeep for General Patton in the war. My dad, he was in the Korean War. He started out in the National Guard like Jeff did, and then Jeff.
You loved like being in the military.
Jeff was always wanted to go to the military since we were kids. And then as we got older, he would get like Army fatigues, and we'd, go out in the woods and, play out Army games, stuff like that.
Jeff was a real lively baby. He was always moving, had to be doing something.
He was always smiling, always happy.
Jeff was very adventurous, always doing something, always out hiking, always into something. He just never could sit still. He was always go, 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 go.
He never gave us any trouble. He truthfully didn't.
He always wanted to jump out of airplanes since we were little kids. I mean, he tried making a sheet out of a bed sheet and make a parachute out when we were kids. He about broke his leg, but you could know since he was a little kid, he was going to end up in the military.
Jeff took a great deal of pride in the fact that he could serve his country, he could protect other people, and make sure that he did it with a great deal of honor and dignity.
Sergeant Hutchinson joined the military at the height of the Cold War. And I think it's important to remember at that time, the then Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact ground forces significantly outnumbered the United States and its allies. It was a very risky, very brave thing for him to do, to join at that point. Sergeant Hutchinson in the Army wasn't just a soldier. He continually sought out opportunities to contribute more, to give more, to take greater risk upon himself, to do more for his fellow soldiers. Sergeant Hutchinson was a member of the 75th Ranger Regiment. Sergeant Hutchinson was the only forward observer in his Ranger Battalion to go through the Ranger Indoctrination Program, Ranger School, and then go to High Altitude Low Opening, or HALO School. Ranger units are part of the United States Special Operations Command. They're sent in the most difficult contingencies that we have. It was well known to Sergeant Hutchinson that anytime the United States is in a conflict, one of the first things we do is we send in the Rangers. By volunteering to be a Ranger, particularly volunteering to be a forward observer, was a very difficult, very risky, hazardous job to take on. Sergeant Hutchinson was selected by his Ranger unit to attend HALO, which is High Altitude Low Opening Parachute School. Very few members of the military are selected to do this. Clearly they saw his potential.
Despite all of his very impressive training, when Jeff went into the Gulf War, unknown to him, he was facing a huge danger that, as it turned out, would follow him the rest of his life.
By August of 1990, Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi army had invaded Kuwait and occupied Kuwait. The United States responded by sending troops to protect Saudi Arabia.
We are determined to knock out Saddam Hussein's nuclear bomb potential. We will also destroy his chemical weapons facilities. Much of Saddam's artillery and tanks will be destroyed. Our operations are designed to best protect the lives of all the coalition forces by targeting Saddam's vast military arsenal. We will not fail.
Among those protectors were Sergeant Hutchinson.
Because that was the first thing me and Jeff said that morning on the 2nd when Saddam invaded Kuwait was, we're going to war.
What was being sold to us was it was the mother of all wars, huge army.
You're thinking about you're fixing to die. You're fixing to go up against the 4th or 5th largest army in the world.
Sergeant Hutchinson arrives in Saudi Arabia shortly after the occupation of Kuwait by the Iraqi army, and he remains in Saudi Arabia training with his infantry counterparts.
We also prepared for a chemical attack. Army gave us mop suits and little white pills that they called a deterrent for nerve agent.
In anticipation of large-scale nerve gas attacks by the Iraqis in the Gulf War, the military command had made the decision to administer to the troops in a preventive fashion medicine called pyridostigmine bromide, anti-nerve gas pills. It turns out that would not have been effective against sarin.
Once we got into Saudi Arabia, the third week we were there, they put us in MOP 2, and now all that is it's a charcoal suit.
The suits that we were issued were in a plastic, came in a plastic container, but we lived in the chemical suits the majority of the time there. And that's what we wore. We wore those for a very, very, very long time.
The directions say they're supposed to be changed every 24 hours or so because they rapidly become ineffective. So after a day or two wearing them, if you continue wearing them, it's like not wearing one at all.
I wore the same suit I had when I deployed there for the whole time I was there, till we got out of the desert of Iraq back into Saudi Arabia, and they told us just to throw it away.
Air War started on January 17, 1991. Sergeant Hutchinson was air mobiled with a group of 5 other soldiers, and they were placed into the Four Corners region.
He was stationed right up at the front, in fact, somewhat behind enemy lines. After the third night of bombing of the chemical weapons production storage facilities, we think when this sarin cloud came over, that position would have been exposed first and most heavily.
No sooner did we get in there and start getting everybody all lined up, there's an explosion in the bunker, and as soon as it exploded, all the horns and all the NBC equipment started going off, and so we jumped into MOP 4, and that's where we stayed for about 12 hours trying to figure out what this was that they had blown up.
Every little camp had this M8A1 alarm that would detect that, and these were reliable alarms. However, the sensitivity of this alarm was set pretty high, so the amount of nerve gas in the air had to be substantial before it would go off, before the alarm would go off, because they didn't want false alarms going off. If your alarm went off, you would be exposed to an amount of sarin that within 5 or 10 minutes would cause you to have brain long-term effects. Multiple people that one was stationed right with him, they all said that they heard nerve gas alarms going off over and over, and finally it ran the battery down on the detector. So they definitely had an intense exposure up there.
It was never explained to us what we got into when it blew up or why, but they did make us go decon before we went back to Saudi Arabia. We had to go wash the vehicles and wash ourselves and get all cleaned in order to drive into Saudi Arabia.
Sergeant Hutchinson was deployed and went into Iraq as part of the ground invasion. That war was over relatively quickly. Sergeant Hutchinson, on the third or fourth day of that war, however, one of his colleagues called in a fire mission, and with using munitions specifically designed for anti-personnel. Part of Sergeant Hutchinson's mission was to do what's called a BDA, which is a battle damage assessment. In that, he went and he observed the site in which the rounds landed. And I think for a young non-commissioned officer, that was his first real exposure to the carnage that is war. There, he saw the multiple dozens of casualties of Iraqi soldiers. And such death in war is not particularly clean. They were literally bodies blown apart, heads, rib cages, arms, legs. And that was his exposure to the realities of modern war. The ceasefire to the conflict was called within a day or two after that.
It wasn't easy. It was a change. It just you can't unsmell it. You can't undo it. Yeah. And it's the stuff you gotta live with. It's just the smell got into your pores, got into your. It's not something that is we hardly ever talk about or hardly ever discuss because it's so gruesome, and you just try to smoke a cigarette, drink a beer, and go on.
Sergeant Hutchinson returned from Desert Storm in April 1991 to Fort Benning. In my experience of dealing with veterans and having spoken with Sergeant Hutchinson and looked at his records, I think he returned damaged. No one goes through what he went through in terms of exposure to danger, in terms of being in close proximity to his own possible death, and remains the same.
Unknown to Jeff and his family, when he came home, it was already inevitable that he would face a lifetime of impairment that would substantially alter his life.
When Jeff came back from the war, initially I was like extremely grateful that he was back in one piece. But it wasn't long after that he started showing signs.
Jeff came home and he wasn't the same as he was before. It's obviously an experience that had a profound impact on his personality and his psyche.
He was a little different. He more kind of reserved, kind of kept his feelings to himself.
Jeff used to love people. He was kind of like a little social man butterfly. And he didn't want to be around people. Noise never bothered him. It really bothered him. But he was very cautious of people.
After the war, he seemed like he was stressed just all the time.
He used to always be going places, doing things. The get up and go was gone. He would just forget. Got to a point he had to start writing things down in a book just so he could remember. And then even looking at that, he'd say, God, that can't be right. But yeah, his memory got really, really bad. And then progressively, he got a little worse and a little worse.
He stayed with me and my wife for about 2 months after he got back at our house with my kids. And that's when I first seen the vomiting blood, his skin bleeding for no reason. At one time I was going to dial 911. He was throwing up like blood clots, and he said, "Oh no, this is just, it's a sickness we got from over in the Gulf War."
We tried to get him into the VA, but the VA wouldn't have. They said, no, there's nothing we can do. There's nothing wrong.
He's been known to be in the doctor's office, and they threw him out because he was just throwing up blood. But here the kid was throwing up blood in the sink, and the doctors made him leave. That didn't make sense. He had rashes and itch. He never would itch or anything. I mean, first thing he'd be in the shower trying to get it cleaned off, just hoping it'd help.
I saw him sick. It was coming out both ends, the blood. We'll just put it that way. He just mentally wasn't the same either.
Jeff believed truly that he had Gulf War illness is what they called it at the time. And the VA, nobody was doing anything about it.
Jeff was experiencing severe symptoms of Gulf War illness, which at the time nobody believed was real. The Department of Veterans Affairs and the Defense Department were not recognizing that Gulf War illness was a real condition.
The war had profoundly affected the way that Jeff was able to react, but he was still going out of his way to try to make change for the better for the people that served like he did. He tried to set up an 800 line for other veterans that were being afflicted by the same type of symptoms that he had. Again, he's not a medical professional. He didn't know anything about it, but he knew that what had happened to him, and it had happened to a lot of other people during that war, they came home and they were getting zero help from the VA or the military or anybody. It was more or less an attempt to form some sort of a support group on how these guys could help each other get better.
Jeffrey Hutchinson was an Army Ranger who spent most of Desert Storm behind enemy lines. He watched as the engineers destroyed the biggest depot of Iraqi armaments that he'd ever seen. 25 hangar-sized bunkers, each big enough to hold a B-52.
These two buildings that I looked in were filled to the ceiling with artillery rounds, mortar rounds, rockets.
When the bunker went up, smoke rings floated 3 miles into the air.
We came across the border back into Saudi Arabia. A lot of guys had diarrhea. Some guys were throwing up.
Over the next 5 years, Hutchinson would develop chronic fatigue, memory loss, night sweats. Then early this year, Jeffrey Hutchinson suddenly dropped 60 pounds in a 4-month bout of nausea.
No doubt in my mind, Jeff has Gulf War illness and had it since the end of his Gulf War service. We all know now that it's caused by sarin nerve agent. The diagnosis was originally made and definitively made by Dr. William Baumschweiger, who did the most thorough evaluation of Jeff ever done. And his recorded evaluation was extremely thorough, and he covered all the various aspects of Gulf War illness. He enumerated all of the symptoms, which just fit like a glove with what we know of Gulf War illness. And he did the various tests that are sensitive to this kind of brain damage. The kind of brain damage that Gulf War illness has is called damage to executive function. It takes special testing to detect that, and Dr. Baumschweiger did that and got positive results and made a definitive diagnosis.
We do what we do because our country needs us to do it. That's war. That's what your job is. But there's that piece of you that ever so often comes out. Then there's no putting that genie back in the bottle. And it's very, very hard to contain that genie all the time. You know that you're dooming yourself. And nobody's going to look at you the same ever again. And then they wanted to send you back to the world and say, don't ever let that genie back out. It ain't that easy.
I'd definitely like the Clemency Board to remember that Jeff was a soldier first and foremost. Everything he did was for his family, his friends, the people he loved, and the country he served. He was a soldier who didn't get the help he needed when he needed it before it could have caused further problems, and he at least deserves some leniency for that.
I'm proud that my brother has chosen to stand up and be as good of a person as he can possibly be in this dire situation that he's in. You know, it kills you here to see him go through that.
Jeff's a good person. He is my brother. He's taught me everything I know. I talk to him every day. I couldn't imagine life without him. I mean, you know, it's horrible where he's at, but at least I can still talk to him. He's very much into his Catholic faith. He helps people in the prison, other inmates. He prays with them. I just think it'd be a big disservice to to humanity by, executing him. I really do. I think Jeff can still do good even if he's in prison. He can help people. I really wish the clemency board could know him as a person. If you knew the man that I know, this wouldn't even be a question.
He's been one good boy to raise. Never give us any trouble much at all. And if he told you something, you could bet your bottom dollar on it. That was the truth. He couldn't have been a better son.
I am begging for mercy for my brother because when he came back from the war, Jeff was sick. He wanted other soldiers to be saved, not just himself. If somebody would have listened to him back then, I don't think any of this would have ever happened. I'm begging for mercy on my brother's life.